Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about the API monitoring landscape. So I'll get started. We're going to go through a round of introductions, but just real quick so you know who's talking. My name is Saoirse Hingsman. I'm the Digital Content Marketing Manager here at SmartBear. And today we're going to have our webinar, obviously, Trailblazing the API monitoring landscape. I'm super excited to get started. And we have a couple guests with us, which I'm so excited about. I'm really looking forward to hearing their input. So we have Bill from Nordic APIs and SK from Everbridge, and I'll, like I mentioned earlier, I'll let them introduce themselves in a few slides. But I just want to give you kind of a better idea of what our path will look like today. So like I mentioned before, we'll go through introductions in a second, but then we'll just touch briefly upon what an API is. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with what an API is, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page here. And then we'll talk about the API economy today, and we'll talk about why monitoring your APIs is important, and then we can talk about how you can get started, what some best practices are. We'll share a couple examples, and then we can go into a Q&A session. And just so everybody knows, with Zoom, you can actually ask questions as we go along, and the panelists will receive those questions. So feel free to type any questions you may have into the chat, and you can specify whether you want to just show it to the panelists, I believe, or if everybody sees. Actually, I think we might be able to see if type in our response and make sure that everybody can see it. But I'll probably just speak it out because I think that's the best way to do things. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, obviously I introduced myself. I'm on the bottom right here, so I'll let Dennis take it away. I have him in the studio with me today.
All right, how's it going? I'm Dennis Goodwin. I'm the product owner for AlertSite here at SmartBear.
All right, and Bill and SK, I don't know if you guys have your audio on yet, but whoever would like to take it away first, please feel free.
Yeah, is this working?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, hey Saoirse, hey Dennis, and SK. Thanks for having me involved. Yeah, like Saoirse said, my name is Bill Doerrfeld, and I'm the editor-in-chief for Nordic APIs. And what we do is we help educate and share knowledge around API design, business, strategy, marketing, security, and other subjects. Outside of the blog, Nordic APIs, we host events and conferences around the world. And yeah, so that's kind of a very high level view of what we do in my role.
Definitely. And their conferences are really fun. I would recommend going.
Thank you.
We had actually our VP on, and who, if you're an AlertSite customer, I'm sure, or Load Complete customer at SmartBear, I'm sure you're familiar with who he is. He spoke, I think last month or the month before, and really enjoyed it. So
thanks.
You guys should check it out. And then SK, if you're on the line, if you want to introduce yourself really quick.
Sounds good. Thank you for inviting me, Saoirse, Dennis, Bill. We're looking forward to having a productive conversation amongst ourselves as well as the participants. My name is SK Bhachech. I'm the Director of Service Quality here at Everbridge. We provide critical communications for all sorts of industries, and as we talk later, we'll talk about how Everbridge uses APIs for a variety of different purposes, and more importantly, why monitoring is important, which is part of what I do here at Everbridge.
Awesome. Sounds good. I'm excited to get started. So let's go through this real quick. I wanted to kind of get us all on the same page really quickly, just to take a step back and look at how fast we've progressed, right? So you can see on this chart that in 1986, which honestly is not that long ago, like let's just take a second to think about that 100% of the US households didn't even have internet. So now we're talking about something that's a bit more complex than just that situation, but just to sort of show the speed with which we're able to innovate and add new things, and that they become commonplace and something that we use and rely on every day is just a little bit staggering. So just keep that in mind as we go through. So, as technologies evolve, it's great. We have more innovation. We continue to use and drive new ideas and new things that help us basically live our lives a little bit easier, a little bit better, right? But as that continues to grow, obviously things become a lot more complex. So whether that's If you're like a business and you're trying to go through digital transformation, so trying to be able to connect with your consumers on a different way or share information in a different way. Another thing that kind of leads into that, right, is this whole idea of mobile first. So, obviously we're all really reliant on our mobile devices as it is, not just even for calls or texts anymore. It's really for a breadth of different functionalities, right? So being able to make sure that you can support that. And then transforming the way that you're building your infrastructure, right? So shifting to more of a microservices focus, or if you are in the financial industry, adopting open banking. And then obviously for any e-commerce site, if you're not even necessarily limited to e-commerce, but I feel like it's a big buzzword in that sort of area, is creating a really successful omni-channel strategy, right? Being able to sort of carry that user experience regardless of what device you're using or where you are. So I just wanted to highlight here that, it's great. We're innovating, we're making all these great new strides, but it does become more complex. And that sort of leads into this slide here, where what do all of these have in common is APIs, right? A lot of these are built with APIs, and those are really the foundation of moving forward with those initiatives. And so obviously, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with what an API is, but just to give a little bit of background, APIs are really a clearly defined way of communicating between various software components. So to simplify it as much as I can there, that's really sort of where these connections between either legacy systems or separate modules come into play. Is really APIs sort of power those initiatives, right? And so kind of, yep, like I had said before, they're really the building blocks behind being able to take these strides. And so I like to show this graph just because it's sort of like the other graph with the internet. It really just shows how fast we've moved. So you can see in 2012 there, it's a decent amount of APIs, but by 2016 and today, there's 19,000 public-facing APIs. And that doesn't even encompass, the variety of different internal facing APIs that exist in the world. So just kind of something to keep in mind when you are thinking about why API monitoring becomes important and what sort of role it plays in your overall environment. And so I kind of wanted to open up the floor a little bit. So Dennis, SK, Bill, if you guys have any sort of commentary on why you think, this growth has been supported in the last couple of years, or if there's any sort of trends that you're seeing in this space in terms of like why people are adopting more APIs quickly, what sort of use cases have you guys seen? I know we touched upon a couple, but if there's anything else that you guys would like to add there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're seeing a lot of initiatives in terms of worldwide regulation that I think is adding to the API economy right now. Look at the open banking movement in the EU and PSD2 and how that is opening up, the floor for so many other financial institutions to now have an API strategy. So that's just one impact that I think is really, fueling the fire right now. But I think it really started with many things, and there's been so many drivers. I mean, the ethos of open source, I think, was an initial driver. We saw social media apps reaching new platforms with APIs, and a lot of businesses realized that this had a lot of potential and sought to monetize access to either functionality or big data. And like you said, Saoirse, we've seen this huge growth of the app boom in Silicon Valley, startup climate. It's really decentralized things to the point where we now have hundreds of personal accounts and we're using hundreds of apps. And if not hundreds or thousands of startups are supporting these brands, startups and enterprises. So the current web economy is really intermingled and dependent. And as a result, I think the infrastructure kind of matches that and has gotten more niche. And APIs are, like you said, the standard mechanism for transferring data now.
Definitely. They're a little bit more lightweight too. Makes it easier to sort of.
And I'll add to that on the other end of the spectrum, right? As larger companies, existing companies, Bill talked about startups and how it's easier for them to provide their APIs and tap into others' APIs. On the other end of the spectrum, like larger companies, growing companies, they find it more flexible to be able to go in the microservices direction, where one small dev team could be focused on that one feature functionality as a microservice and expose an API to their counterparts within the same company. All that also is accelerating the growth and the adoption of APIs.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we see this graph from using the programmable web data, but it should be reminded that this is just for public-facing APIs. I mean, there's a lot going under the scenes, streamlining internal operations and partner-to-partner API connections that we don't have the great data to reflect that, but it's evolving just the same.
Right. And what we're seeing, with our customers is that those APIs are being used to allow the same functionality to be shared across many interfaces, whether it's the web and mobile, or even internally, more granular kind of slice and dice to get different apps to different groups inside an organization. But that becomes the framework that lets you standardize, the data portion of it, and then the UIs can be kind of customized to whoever needs them.
Definitely. All good thoughts. Awesome. I'm excited. I think, honestly, it's a really good topic, especially for, obviously, I feel like we're all kind of in the weeds with this to a certain extent, but even just to think about it from a consumer perspective is like, you don't really think about the ability that, the technology behind what supports your sort of experiences, right? And I think something that speaks to how fast we've grown is like you become dependent on these things and you sort of expect this level of like, whether it's speed or functionality or just like the idea that you want to be surprised, you want to be wowed with how great it is it just speaks volumes. So like you don't really understand what's happening on the back end, but the ability to be able to do that continuously and to continuously sort of shock people with your ability to like envision and then create and build and share these amazing digital experiences is something that's it has a lot of value to the market today, which is really, really cool.
And it's hard to shock people nowadays with overexposure in the media. It just means that the technology has to be even more innovative.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's something that's like crazy to think of, right? And so I kind of wanted to map this out a little bit. I kind of touched upon the fact that everything goes really fast and, everybody's sort of adopting this idea of like, we need to figure out how we can leverage API capabilities to make what we do better in some way or add a new functionality, right? Or a capability. And so I kind of want to talk about why that happened. Like, how did we end up where we are, right? And so there are a couple of reasons for this, obviously, but I like to sort of bucket it into these three categories, right? Is that it's faster. You can add new functionalities without having to build entire components, I guess, from scratch. Like you can, whether it's a framework, open source, or being able to, as SK touched upon earlier, being able to integrate a microservices architecture into, what were sort of singular entities before makes it easier to innovate and continuously fix or update whatever products you may have. And then on top of that, it's cheaper, right? I kind of touched upon it a second ago, but being able to fix things without necessarily fixing parts of a system without having to sort of rework the entire thing saves time, saves money. It makes it a lot easier and cheaper for you to continuously innovate and continuously integrate new things into your products. And then from just building off of that, APIs are also smarter. There's a better way to do this, right? You have a lot more language and framework flexibility than you did before. Again, with the microservices example, it's super helpful to be able to just sort of plug and play or pick one module that you're like, okay, you know what? I know that this can be improved. I'm just going to work on this. And you can divide it out by teams or whatever you want to do, but it makes it a lot more scalable, a lot faster, and it saves you money and time in the end. So I think this really sort of speaks to the ability of companies to sort of take that in and adopt it and integrate it into their current workflows as well. Right. So obviously, we had talked about growth, how fast we've gone and why it's important. But, we're never sort of, we've never sort of made it, right? Like there are always updates that need to happen. There are always things that need to change, things that can be optimized and things that we can do better. And so I kind of wanted to share some of the findings that we had found over the last year and a half or year or so ago when we did the State of API Monitoring survey. So based on that survey, the feedback that we got was that, the industry is still adapting, right? Like API performance continues to be a challenge for everyone trying to push new APIs or old APIs into production and have them work as they had envisioned before, right? So I think two of the sort of statistics that really speak volumes here are the first one being that less than 10% of API issues are resolved within 24 hours. From a monitoring perspective, that's something that's super, super relevant, right? Like you want to make sure that you're able to fix them. 24 hours is a decent amount of time, depending on the problem. Dennis is looking at me like, huh.
I would say 24 hours, almost too big nut to look at from a problem standpoint, but yes.
But yeah, I think that's just something that you're like, wow, I was unaware of that, but it's something that obviously people are still struggling with. And it's also why monitoring is important. If you're able to catch them, and if you, depending on the tool that you select, right, that will be that process, that remediation, whole series of events and chains of, emails or interactions, it become not necessarily the easiest thing in the world, but it becomes a lot easier. It's a lot more streamlined. You can help identify what's going on, right? And then obviously the second challenge would be balancing speed of delivery and then API quality. So obviously you want to release quickly, but you don't want to be releasing bad code. You want to make sure that everything's working properly and that what you're releasing is of good quality. Another fun fact for you guys is that nearly 1 in 4 API quality issues will remain unresolved for a week or more. That to me is also startling, because if you're thinking about where APIs are placed in, the big picture here, they're supporting key functionalities, right? Business functionalities, things that need to be working and need to be of quality, whether it's speed or functionality. Those two things need to be in place. At that point, it doesn't really matter that it's available. It's like, what good does it do if it's available and it's not working how it's supposed to? So that's also another thing that you can improve, right, from monitoring your APIs. And then the last one should be a pretty obvious one, right? Like you're going to lose customers if your APIs aren't of good quality. And so trying to understand ways that you can inject quality at each part of the software development lifecycle and then ensure that once those are in the wild, they're working as you envisioned them and how you had intended them to work. So I had kind of touched upon this as well, but how can we address these concerns, right? Is understanding how your APIs are monitoring, not only in the wild, but also being able to catch those issues fast and coordinate and collaborate with your team on making sure that, oh, this is not working. We know before anybody else has experienced it, so we have time to go back. You looped in the right people, and you can understand how to fix those problems fairly quickly. And so from this standpoint, I think there's a lot of ambiguity around what API monitoring actually is, right? So a lot of people are familiar with like up-down API monitoring, checking that your endpoint is available, which is great. Obviously, you need to know that it's available. But in today's world, it's not necessarily enough anymore to just know that it's available. So what we like to define API monitoring as is the ability to have visibility into not only the availability, but also the performance and the functional correctness of your API. So essentially, are they available all the time? Are they fast? And are they functioning properly? So I like to include this here just because it kind of speaks to the essence of the problem that we're trying to solve, right? So why would you want to monitor your APIs? So we're obviously taking it from a more synthetic point of view. So being able to catch issues earlier, right? So the goal here is to make sure that when something bad does happen, which inevitably it will, regardless of how amazing you are, things happen, right? There are unexpected, elements that come into play, things happen. So what we're trying to do is slow that process down and be able to identify and capture problems before it becomes a real issue. So if you have a monitor set up on your API transactions and you're able to detect that there's a deviation in the performance or something is degrading, before anybody in real life can experience those problems, it will save you a whole lot down the line. And so that's sort of our main goal there. But I wanted to open the floor again to Dennis and all of our panelists too. So SK and Bill, if you guys have any comments on why you think it would be important to monitor your APIs. I know that obviously Dennis and I share the same sort of sentiment here, but
yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say is you have a variety of API endpoints, right? And knowing that those endpoints are up and running is good and critical, obviously. Making sure they're all performing quickly, in the right, the right speed expectation, that's important. But knowing that they're all working correctly is, I think, really a key distinction from simply pinging a bunch of endpoints and making sure they're up. It's making sure that they're functionally correct, they're doing what they're supposed to do, and they're interacting properly with each other. So the ability to create, a multi-step transactional flow that mirrors what that API is going to do to serve up, functionality in a mobile app, for example, or website, or interacting with third parties or customers directly. It's all of the key specific transactions that occur as those API endpoints are all interacted with. It's being able to monitor those key user journeys to know that everything's doing what it's supposed to do, and it's fast.
Definitely. So SK or Bill, do you guys know of, I know SK that you obviously monitor your APIs, but either SK or Bill, do you guys know of any companies that are monitoring their APIs today, and what the big picture problem is that they're trying to solve by doing that and by investing in a tool that will help them sort of get visibility into what's going on in real life?
Yeah, I think a really interesting case is what GitHub has been doing. They coined the term chat ops. I don't know if you guys are familiar with their setup, but they basically use Hubot in like a very chat conversational way. And their internal ops team sees all the notifications for things related to monitoring, and they interact with their servers through this bot in this kind of chat framework. It's a really interesting way for like very real-time response and error resolution. Yeah, I just thought that was an interesting case study.
Yeah, we actually have a couple of customers who are starting down that path of I guess I don't even know what to describe it. It's really just a methodology and a process, right, around a whole bunch of different inputs, come flying into it. So that, obviously they're bringing some alert site information in, and it sits alongside a variety of other tools they have in place.
Yeah,
so we have seen that ourselves.
I actually, I come from about 15 years of web and performance monitoring background, and so my take on this is that if, as a company, whether it's internal or externally facing APIs are any significant part of your business, which nowadays most companies have that as a fact, right? Then, and if you're not monitoring that API, then you don't care about your bread and butter, and you're doing something wrong, right? Because the moment that API becomes unavailable, the moment that whether it's an internal microservice or a mobile API or an API that you expose to your customers and partners, right? The moment that it becomes unavailable, you're not able to provide the service that your customers are paying you for effectively. So again, I think it's a no-brainer in my eyes that if you're not monitoring, then you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And one thing I would say is, I think in some cases, folks are monitoring their web applications, and then by default, I think they feel pretty comfortable that they're hitting the necessary underlying components, which in many cases, are APIs. But I think as the number of consumers of those APIs grows and diversifies, that's where the need to hit the API layer directly is becoming more apparent to more people.
Definitely. Yeah, and I wanted to add that we're in a software development environment that is emphasizing, continuous deployment, continuous integration. And so it kind of requires a change of focus. We can't just release web software and let it go. There's no longer are the days of just upfront testing. We need something that's consistently and automatically hitting the API to make sure that everything works after every single new integration, new release. So I think monitoring as opposed to testing is great for the longevity of a service.
Totally, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on too, about how you can integrate monitoring into your development cycle as a whole, not necessarily isolated into production, which is standard, I feel like, across the board, but there's some value in running your tests alongside your monitors as well. And so we actually got a question in that I just want to talk about real quick, just in case people are curious. So someone had asked if we're going to demo an API monitoring tool. Toward the end, we'll go through, SmartBear actually has a tool that Dennis and I work on that helps you monitor your APIs really well. Obviously, and SK actually uses it, so he'll be talking a little bit about how he uses it, and I'll give you a preview of what the UI looks like and what sort of functionalities you can get. So short answer is we're not going to do a full demo, but we're going to give you a lot of information and a real use case as to how you can use it if you would like to. But purpose of this is really just to make sure everybody understands importance and how you can get started. And then if you would like to get started with us, that would be awesome, obviously, and we'll show you how you can do that. But hang tight. So the answer is yes. We'll give you sort of an idea of how you can use AlertSite if you're interested in how you can, especially if you're using SoapUI or SoapUI Pro or Ready API at the moment. Super easy, and we'll show you how to do that at the end. So yes. I'm also going to send out a poll real quick. It's just one question. So if you guys are interested in answering, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll continue to explain. Yep, of course, no problem. So as we had all touched upon, super important that you're making sure that not only are your APIs available, but they're also performing properly, right? So you also want to make sure that they're returning the right data. So really important here. Doesn't matter if they're available if they're not returning the right data. And also key point of this here in terms of a bigger picture perspective, right, is understanding that everybody, whether they're on your team, anybody that needs to be involved, is in the loop about something that's going on with your API problems before they can impact your end users. So you have a little bit more time to remediation there, right? So that touches upon number 3, the challenge that we had talked about earlier, right, is the risk of losing customers. So if you're able to keep that sort of behind the curtain, that's better for you. It's honestly better for your end users as well. Then you're able to fix it quickly, and no one will no one will know that something bad happened. You'll be able to remediate that fast. And then we had kind of touched upon this before as well, is that you wanted to monitor not only your public APIs, but your private partner and third-party APIs as well, because all of those do impact the way that you do business and the way that you exist in the digital world. So it's super important there.
And just that last point, I think, gets at hitting directly all of the key components that make up your application, or that support your broader application from working. Just hitting the web front end isn't really the best way to ensure that all the components are functioning the way they're supposed to be.
Yeah, definitely. And so how can you get started? What does this even mean, right? So let me check this real quick. So crafting an API monitoring strategy. I like to break it down into 7 sort of buckets, right? So the ways that you can understand what's happening in your organization, what you need to do, and how you can move forward. So the first one being is identifying all the major stakeholders. So if something goes wrong, why does it matter? Who's impacted? And then from that perspective, who is involved as well. Second step would be understanding your current architecture, your current setup, what's going on. And then from that point of view, understand what's going on with your APIs. Which ones are you relying on to do what and when? And then taking an end user perspective, right? Understanding what a user journey would look like. And then you need to obviously define a monitor. So figuring out what your monitor would look like, what you need to verify that's working. And then picking a tool that will work for you. So regardless, whatever your team workflow is, it's obviously not ideal to sort of break that up and center your processes around a platform. It's not necessarily feasible. It's not necessarily scalable, especially if you're trying to loop in multiple teams. That becomes really, really difficult and really time consuming. And so then the last one would be, how can you make monitoring not just a siloed, segmented part of your development lifecycle? How can you make sure that you're integrating it into different processes that you have and making sure that you're keeping everybody in the loop? So first one, stakeholders. I like to say, who cares about this, right? If something goes wrong, what happens? Do you want your customers to know first? Obviously, preferably not. So when stuff begins to go wrong, who should get the alerts, right? Who is sort of the first line of defense here? And then how can you make sure that you're defining and amplifying those feedback loops so that when something goes wrong, you're able to quickly and efficiently loop in the right people, make sure they get the right information, and make sure they know how to move forward, right? It's not always necessarily useful to get an error message that you're like, I don't know. I don't know what to do with this. So making sure that you loop in the right people, making sure you don't loop everybody in is another key sort of element here. Not everybody needs to be on the alert list for every single blip or event. You can prioritize that in a little bit. And so I like to think of it as a whole sort of cyclical cycle, right? Like obviously there are people that are impacted, there are people that need to know, and there are people that need to communicate to customers if that is the case. So making sure that you have a plan of action from that point of view. And then the second step would be to assess your architecture, right? So what's going on? What do you rely on? Where are the areas that you don't have visibility into that you think that you should? I like to bring up this image of this is actually from Amazon's microservices architecture. So obviously it's not an easy thing to do, right? This is probably going to be one of the most annoying, tedious sort of steps in the process, but it's also one of the most vital. So understanding what's going on, what APIs do you rely on, and where are they? Where do they live? How is your system set up? And what areas can you be capturing the most value from?
And Saoirse, I think one thing here to keep in mind is if you're tightly integrating with your development lifecycle, you're going to be working with the architects, the coders, and the testers who are coming up with the test approaches for the applications themselves. So that's where tying in the identification of what's going to be monitored works a lot better if you're more plugged in with those folks than if you're starting from scratch as the application's about to roll into production.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. It's not necessarily even just how your system's set up, it's how are your workflows set up. So like I mentioned in the previous step about identifying the stakeholders, it's really important to make sure that you know how you guys are going to work together. Who is it going to be on to define the monitor, right? Is there any way that you can reuse assets from earlier on in the lifecycle, whether it's a API definition or a test script? Are there elements there that you can, it also depends on the tool that you select, but identifying those sorts of, steps in your own process is extremely important. So making sure that you're able to work collaboratively to identify the things that are important. And then obviously something that you want to do is making sure you understand which APIs you're trying to monitor. And when I say that, I want to hone in here on the fact that endpoint monitoring is great. It's good to know that something is up, but I think if you're looking at it from a bigger picture perspective, as a modern company, it's really important to make sure that you're understanding how your APIs are working together. So making sure that you can monitor the entire transaction, making sure that you can validate the payload, and understand really what's going on. So if your user is trying to log in using their Facebook ID and then trying to add something to their cart and then trying to go back and add another thing to their cart and then trying to check out with their PayPal account and authorize that credit card, all of those steps need to work in order to get the final result that you want ultimately. And so it's not just enough to make sure that one thing is up and running. You know, they all have to work together. It's pieces of a bigger picture, right? It's not just a singular sort of event or capability that matters. And then once you're able to identify those critical assets, things that you know are important to your business structure, your business capabilities, right? Then you can go in and think, okay, how would an end user approach this? What are the sort of steps that they would go through? What are some examples of ways that I can understand, you know, if they were trying to purchase something, or if they're trying to research information, or if they're trying to access a certain part of their account? Those interactions are what your monitors are going to reflect. And I know Dennis and I had talked about this previously, if you guys have been on any of our other webinars, but this whole illusion of availability, right? Where you're getting, you know, everything looks good, everything's green, and in reality, there's something breaking on the back end. And that's because you weren't monitoring for that user journey. So understanding not just, okay, I'm going to add something to the cart and then I'm going to leave. Making sure that you think how a real user would think. Like, oh, I really wanted to add this, but you know what? I forgot. I'm going to go back and add this, or I'm going to go in later. This will be saved on my account. It'll be fine. So understanding that scenario is super, super important, right? And then I'd like to tie it in again. So from a transaction perspective, you want to make sure that you're validating what is happening. So if you can identify key assertions or variables that you want to pull in from the previous API call to make sure that they're there, that's super important to make sure that you select a tool that you can do that. You can get that information from. Because otherwise, what are you even monitoring, to be honest? I don't know that it's necessarily useful to know that something is up and not functioning.
Yeah, and this really
if you don't know it's functioning, sorry.
Yeah, this is the crux of the functional correctness portion of what we do, is that, you know, you're really making sure that you're doing exactly, you know, what the application's doing, you know, when an end user's working it. So. Right.
And honestly, like, if you're able to do this, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next step, but if you're able to do this and you're able to sort of integrate that with your testing processes, it'll save you a lot of time. It'll also save you a lot of money. If you reuse test scripts from obviously your test phases, identifying the problem, then going back and fixing it and retrying it and sending the code back will be a lot faster than just using something where you're like, okay, I think it's up, but something happened and now I don't know what's going on. So integrating that process in is super, super important if you can. You have to obviously pick a tool that you can do that, but very, very important. And then I touched upon this earlier, but making sure that you're capturing the full picture, right? So making sure that you're validating what you get back. This is just a quick run through of what it would look like in alert site.
It's almost like a demo.
It is almost like a demo. It's not the demo that I was referring to.
I did do this, so it was live at one point.
Yep, that is true. But yeah, it's really important to make sure you understand what's going on. So this step for this process would be pick out your APIs, pick out the transactions, make sure you're capturing you know, the most useful sort of variables or assertions there. Pick things that you know need to come back in order to get the full functionality here.
But that's the key, right? It's one thing to hit that endpoint, get back a 200 OK, right? It's quite another thing to hit that endpoint and do an assertion against the JSON payload and make sure that it's coming back with exactly what's key to ensure that that endpoint, that step of a multi-step monitor is doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
And then to bring data forward from that step to the next one, if you have a chain set of transactions that you're trying to monitor that are dependent upon the successful completion of the first step, and bringing data forward from that is really what goes from simple monitoring to really advanced synthetic monitoring.
So we have a chat that just came in. I want to share it with everybody because I totally agree with you that it can sometimes be a challenge to formulate the right questions, right? So what would a valid key assertion be, right? I'm going to send that off to either SK to give us a real life example or Dennis to give us another real life example, or Bill, if you want to, if you know some key assertions that would be essential in helping understand what's actually going on in real life.
I can share something that we do actually every minute of every day from multiple locations, which is real quick. Again, going back to what Everbridge does, we send critical communications like there's a fire in this building or there's a tornado coming. So for a corporate customer, it's a fire in the building, or for transportation company, it's there's an active shooter at this airport, or for a state local government, there's a tornado coming. They can initiate all those transactions, all those messages either through our web interface or the API. It's important for us to make sure that the API, the programmatic interface, is available to all of our customers, including our IT alerting customers. We use AlertSite, multiple locations every minute to send a notification using our API. And in the API response, we set an assertion that, look, if you don't get a notification ID that is unique and you don't get a status of success, then fail that API test, and upon certain number of failures, send an alert to our network operations center. And they treat it as the highest severity incident and trigger incident response procedures.
Yeah, definitely useful example. And it just speaks to the importance of that, right? Like you need to know what's happening, what's going on. They'd also suggested that maybe machine learning could help generate the right questions based on the analysis of monitor data. And then if AlertSite can be used to predict problems. So from a machine learning perspective, I would actually default to you, Dennis.
Well, so I think there's two parts, right, to this. One is, synthetic monitoring can be predictive of bigger problems. As you start to see, for example, a lot of times performance degradation will precede a hard failure of an application. That's probably the best simple answer I can give on, how you predict problems. Because you're not looking at all of your real data, which is a different kind of approach. Synthetic monitoring has an ongoing stream of traffic. It's very predictable. It's always doing the same thing, so it's very good for baselining what's expected, and then deviations from that baselining can be used to predict problems. And we often see that failures are preceded by slowdowns. And so that's really one of the strong use cases for synthetic monitoring as a predictor of future problems. And then again, if you start to see erratic behavior, intermittent failures when you're usually 100% available all the time, again, that can be a precursor to a more significant outage. So it's really important to know what's normal for an application and for a monitor, and to set the proper thresholds to take action when you see any kind of deviation from that normal.
Yeah, definitely. We also got another question that asking if we necessarily need SOAP UI Pro for creating an API monitor. The answer is no, you don't. If you have SOAP UI Pro, it's very easy to reuse those test scripts in AlertSite to make a new monitor. You literally just upload the test script. Or if you have Ready API, you can just add the project into AlertSite, actually in the plugin in the platform. But let's say you don't have SOAP UI, that's totally fine. we actually have a couple ways that you can use AlertSite to monitor either your API endpoint and also your API transaction. So we actually have a multi-step process where you can just plug in the endpoint URL and then add your assertions or any variable that you want and build up the steps based of that transaction to make sure that that's working properly. There's anything else you'd like to add, Dennis, to that too?
No, I mean, it's a kind of a two-pronged approach, right? You can reuse your SOAP UI test cases, whether using the open source SOAP UI or SOAP UI Pro, or you can create the API monitors directly in the AlertSite console, one endpoint at a time, string them together, add the assertions, add the variables you need to make, a sophisticated, multi-step transaction right in the UI. So it's really, if you use SOAP UI, great. It couldn't be easier to import a project and create a monitor from test case. You can actually do it right from the SOAP UI and Red API interfaces through a plugin that's included in the application, or you can build them yourselves without code in the AlertSite console.
Or if you're using Open API specification or what used to be called Swagger, or if you're using Swagger Hub, obviously, you can take those definitions and plug that into AlertSite and use that to create a new monitor.
That is a good point, Saoirse. Yes, you
So
can. So yeah,
easy.
You can use those definitions to accelerate the endpoint setup of the monitor right from the definition.
Definitely. So speaking of picking out tools that can fit seamlessly into your workflows, no, it is super important to make sure that what you're going to pick is going to work for you, right? So look at the integrations that you would need, whether it has a good time to value. If you're trying to uproot your whole workflow system and integrate a new platform into multiple teams as well, that can be a really big challenge. So you have to make sure that what you're doing is going to make sense, and what you're doing is going to be useful for you and useful to everybody else on your team as well. And so, obviously with that challenge comes the sort of not only time to value, but ROI on the tool and then, your entire process. So making sure that you take that into consideration as well. And yeah, I kind of touched upon this before, but just making sure that not only if you pick a tool that will work for your team and be able to work seamlessly into your entire organization's workflows, that's something that is incredibly, incredibly powerful and making sure that people are on the same page and making sure that you can reduce your mean time to resolution and making sure that you can get everybody up and running and on the same page, right? And so last step that I would like to suggest would obviously be, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but integrating monitoring into your entire development lifecycle rather than just siloing it into production and having this sort of disconnect between the teams that are supposed to work collaboratively to solve problems, right? So one of the ways that you can do that obviously is to either reuse assets that you have, whether it's definitions from the design and build phase, or if you're reusing tests, that would be great as well. But another way to do that is through there are two sort of parts of this, right? So let's say that you want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So if you can pick a tool where you can configure the alerts to make sure that the right people can get them at the right time, or if you want to be able to share the monitor data with people in your organization or people that may be partners for your organization, that's super, super important as well. And then,
and the one thing I would say is this ties into the previous slide in terms of fitting into your workflows and integrating. I think from a development lifecycle perspective, obviously, the reuse of the scripts brings all that kind of intellectual capital forward, right? You don't have to think about what's important to a given endpoint or a given transaction. You got your kind of assertions and the definition of success already defined, and so the reuse of those assets really takes the load off some of the learning curve on the operations side. They can just kind of inherit that work and get the most out of it right out of the gate.
Definitely.
And then Bill did touch on this earlier, but the other benefit of this is the monitoring itself of the application's pre-production helps all the folks kind of upstream in the process have a better experience. It helps to ensure that the environments are working.
Yeah.
And it also, essentially monitors the monitors before they get to production. So you will prevent an application change from breaking a production monitor by catching that the monitor breaks in the pre-production environment. So, and we see a lot of that happening now, and we see a lot of interest in folks starting to monitor those pre-production environments so that they prevent a monitoring outage from hitting them. Not just an application outage, but failure of the monitors. And then at that point, they go blind to what's going on in production. So they have to back the code out or, scramble to fix the monitors at the last minute. So there's a lot of upside to pushing the monitoring upstream.
Definitely. And so I want to touch real quickly on best practices because I want to share some other really cool stories. So moral of the story is start monitoring earlier, right? Integrate it into your lifecycle, get all the information you can, make sure that you're sharing information with people that are relevant. Secondly, monitor API transactions, right? You don't want to just monitor an endpoint. It's not necessarily enough. You need to know that transactions are performing, available, and functioning properly. So then monitor from different locations, right? Make sure that it's working across the globe, not just from one location, because oftentimes you'll get one location that isn't functioning properly. And then from that perspective as well, make sure that you're monitoring not only your external facing APIs, but your internal facing APIs as well.
Saoirse,
yep.
I can interrupt. We have a question about how to hit APIs or web services that are behind firewalls. So just really fast, we have the ability to monitor from public nodes around the world. We also have the ability to deploy nodes into your internal network so that you can monitor things that are not public facing.
Definitely. And then obviously keep end users in mind, right? Make sure that you're trying from different locations when you set up the monitor. Make sure you're configuring the alerts so that the right people get them at the right time. Making sure that you configure the monitor so that you're running them from different locations, you're running the right user journeys, etc. Then make sure you're defining the responsibilities. You know who's responsible for what and how to interact with everybody together. Then obviously you want to set benchmarks for your performance so you know when you're deviating. And then monitor your SLAs as well. So hold your vendors accountable and make sure that your metrics are aligned to your business objectives. So I want to jump into SK's example real quick so that we have time because I know that his example will be awesome. So SK, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, I already talked about a couple of the key points, so I may be repeating myself, but yes, and I think the top down. I think early on it was all about availability of the APIs, right? Just like the availability of our websites. And once we got comfortable with the availability is when the second if you will, we graduated from kindergarten and went into elementary school, and we started trending performance of our APIs. And then when we were comfortable with the performance, right, that just that the API server and that endpoint we're just talking public facing, right? It is stable and it's performing well. Then the light bulb went on that we actually need to do functional testing, right? That we need to be able to make sure that we trigger the API, the right API methods, and there are multiple methods that perform different things. So all the right methods that to be able to test all the various functionality that we make available through our public-facing API. This is where that assertion example that I talked about came in, right? And you can see in the pictures that the monitoring, alert side monitoring is right there, but it takes up about 40% of the screen real estate in front of our NOC because there's a lot of not just web monitoring but also API monitoring that is embedded right in front of the NOC there. The next evolution that of our monitoring strategy comes in for the other aspects of APIs, right? We briefly talked about how companies are going in the microservices direction, the mobile first initiative as well. Those two things are actually very relevant to Everbridge because we have a couple of mobile apps that are useful for our customers, and guess how the mobile apps talk to the backend? They talk over an API. And as our company continues to grow, we are breaking out our monolithic product into microservices, and those microservices talk to each other and the remnant core monolithic product through APIs. And so but these APIs are internal only, and they're not exposed externally. So the next evolution that's coming for us, and this is something we've been thinking about internally and talking to our alert site account manager, is, as Dennis mentioned, right? Private node. Using private node so that we can monitor our microservices internally and make sure that a given functionality does not break internally, which may or may not result in the right type of alerting, because not all alerting services are going to be able to catch that. Whereas if we're specifically monitoring that API, then we'll be able to catch it. And if you wouldn't mind just going to the next slide, I think this is a very high level of what we do, which is we don't just stop at exercising the API and saying that, oh, you know what, the API is functioning fine. We use the API to create what we call as a notification, and then that our platform is making a phone call or sending an email or an SMS or lighting up that amber sign on the side of the street. But well, not every one of those methods can be tested, but at least an SMS, an email, or phone call method can be tested. And we, on the other end, we have synthetic phone numbers and SMS numbers and email addresses that are then being monitored using a combination of alert site and internal tools. So we know that we're going from one end all the way to the other end, and that our customers are getting full value out of our platform.
Definitely.
Which is a very thorough implementation of making sure you monitor the full transaction that your users go through.
Right. I'm just going to really quickly, because I promised that I would, I'll go through how AlertSite can help you, right? So all the things we had mentioned before about reusing your test scripts, being able to get up and running quickly, and really seeing that time to value and that ROI from not only the APIs that you have, but also the tool itself. That's something that's really important. And then being able to monitor internally and externally from a variety of different locations across the world. And then one of the things that I kind of didn't touch upon, but someone had asked a question about for false alarms. One thing that AlertSite's really, really good at doing is not sending false alarms and sending alarms instantly when something is actually wrong. And that's through a variety of different preferences, a variety of different sort of platform capabilities that are instilled in AlertSite. But that is one thing that we really help with. And then making sure that you can get everybody in the loop, whether it's through alert configuration or sharing monitor data to a partner or any sort of stakeholder that is involved. And then something that we didn't talk about is really just from a SmartBear perspective, our customer success team is obviously really awesome. We're here to help you. We want to make sure that you're getting the best out of your tool and making sure that you're functioning the best that you can, right? So really quick, I'll play this.
AlertSite makes it easier than ever to monitor your internal, partner, or public APIs. Our monitoring network spans over 80 locations, giving you full global visibility into your API performance. You can monitor your API endpoints, your multi-step API transactions.
So this is the multi-step transaction.
Or even reuse the assets you already have,
and this
whether
is
it's SoapUI test scripts
or Ready API
or Open API specification files.
Swagger files too. So that was just a really quick overview of AlertSite. You can see the UI a little bit.
AlertSite makes
get a better sort of understanding of what's going on. We kind of ran out of time. If you have any additional questions, please let me know. I can forward that on as well. And I know that we answered some as things went along, but just to make sure that, you're not leaving like, wait, I wanted to ask. I'm literally available all the time. I'd love to chat, especially about if you're having any challenges or questions, or if you want to see a more in-depth demo, we can definitely set that up.
I can do it live too, by the way.
We can do it live. We can do another really follow-up as well. And if you'd like a copy of the slides, I know someone had just asked me, definitely I can, if you send me an email, I don't have your personal email off the top of my head, but if you send me an email, it was included in your invite email, feel free and I'll send them over. I I have to add one more thing to the slide before I send it over, but definitely can do that. So thank you all for bearing with us. I know we ran over time. I really appreciate it. As always, if you have any questions, anything, let me know. And big shout out and thank you to Bill and SK for joining us. It's so much more fun when it's not just Dennis and I talking, because we talk about this stuff all the time. So anybody, any sort of external input is super awesome. So thank you very much. I know that it's a time commitment for sure. So I really appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody else has as well. So thank you guys. Hope you have a great day and great rest of the week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.